Hello, and welcome to Insightful Conversations with your host, Three Principles practitioner, Adey-Jones. Join her each week as she welcomes some of the world's leading Three Principles teachers and practitioners who share how this understanding has dramatically improved the quality of their lives and the lives of those they work with.
I'm very excited to have Alvin Dawkins with me today. Alvin is a jazz bassist, composer-songwriter, a recording artist, Three Principles coach, and soon-to-be author. Alvin grew up in the ugliness of Alabama's Jim Crow segregation and apartheid, and he also lived in the heart and center of the 1960s civil rights movement. Inspired and informed by these life experiences, in addition to a master's degree in spiritual psychology, Alvin is passionately drawn towards having enlightening and honest conversations around social and economic injustices, unconscious bias, white privilege, and racism, and how these often shape and inform many white spiritual communities. Welcome, Alvin. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited for this conversation. So before we get into, today we're going to be talking about, our spiritual communities and what we can do to address issues around, racism and social and economic injustices. But before we get into that, I would love you to share a little bit about what it was like for you growing up in Alabama during, the Jim Crow segregation and apartheid, and then also being witness to the 1960s civil rights movement. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that first.
Absolutely. Sure. Let me say first, Del, it's great to be with you today as well. Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to our time together here today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. During that time of the 60s was a pretty tumultuous time. I grew up during very stark and vivid segregation. I didn't witness it so much in my neighborhood that I grew up there. I didn't interact, if you will, with white people all that much. There was the occasional insurance man that would come once a week or so to collect insurance dues or premiums. But it wasn't until we as a family went to town on Saturdays. This was before the era of shopping malls and all of that. So we had an actual thriving downtown with mass transit and all of that. It was then when I saw more visible signs of segregation, like the separate drinking fountains in some of the stores, like the Greyhound or the Trailways bus station had a separate drinking fountain. So did the Seaboard Coastline, Atlantic Coastline Railroad Station, where we would go to pick up family that was traveling in town. We would see that. Also, when I would go to my doctor's office, a family doctor, I remember as a little boy sitting in that small waiting room and seeing the sign above the door that said colored waiting room. And I didn't know what that meant for some amount of time. And I remember asking my parents one day what that meant. And they told me. Some few years later, after that office had integrated, we then started meeting in a much larger, much nicer, air-conditioned waiting room with magazines and all of that. I thought the office had built a new addition. Oh. As it turned out, that office had been there all along. It's just it had been the separate whites-only reception room.
Oh my gosh, I can't imagine. I mean, my skin is just crawling hearing this. I just can't even imagine what that must have felt like growing up in that environment. But please continue. I'm just having a visceral reaction to hearing what you're sharing here. So
yeah, just recalling some of the memories of that. And I have to qualify that because, I grew up a very happy little boy. Again, I grew up in a very vibrant, loving, supportive, stable neighborhood. My parents and all of my neighbors. And because we lived in a segregated neighborhood, there was an economic mix in the neighborhood. I grew up with a lot of school teachers, principals, business owners, doctors, as well as working class people. For instance, my parents were working class. My dad mostly did factory work and my mom worked as a maid. But I saw these models in my neighborhood. So a lot of my neighbors were mentors. I knew as a small child, for instance, that I wanted to go to college because I saw it modeled in many of my neighbors. I saw that they could afford nicer things, a better car, and when I go in their homes. They had color TV and air conditioning. It's funny when I think about that, because I don't think many people even recall that there was a time we had black and white television, right?
I remember.
But yeah, they had color TV. And one thing that really stood out is that a lot of those families, particularly the school teachers' families, they all had a set of World Book Encyclopedia, the whole set. And my parents could never afford a set for my brother and me because they were very, very expensive. So those were very stark reminders of the class difference in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, the reason I actually wanted to have this conversation with you in particular was because I am participating in Rahini Ross and Julianne Shazat's incredible, it's really an amazing program, the Reimagining Our Spiritual Communities. Yeah. And you spoke a couple of weeks ago, and again, it really touched me because we both belong to the Three Principles community, and we also both attended the University of Santa Monica, and affectionately known as USM. Mm-hmm. And you were sharing that while you were at USM, we weren't there the same year, but in those rooms, which we both know is what so many people just poured their hearts out. They shared the most intimate, painful, vulnerable experiences. Right. And you shared a couple of weeks ago that you didn't feel safe in those rooms to share your experience around racism. And that touched me at such a deep level. I just thought I need to have this conversation with you. Yeah, I just want to hear what that was like for you, why you did not feel safe sharing your experience.
Yeah, well, it didn't feel, and I'll need to qualify that as well, because you and I both know we got many wonderful experiences. I call it the room. The other students affectionately call it being in the room. But I've got so many gifts from having gone to USM. It's just that there were instances in a trio sharing, for instance, more than one, a few of them, where in sharing, being in the chair, I would mention something about some of what I've shared with you earlier about my childhood and teenage experiences growing up here in Alabama. And more often than not, the response I would get would be something attuned to, "Oh, Alvin, that's really, really sad that you lived through that, you experienced that. Period. Isn't it great that things are no longer like that?" And while that's true, there's been some very tangible, visible changes. The needle hasn't moved all that much. And you and I both know that any number of murders of unarmed Black men by the police, just name them. Well, getting that response from more than one person and in more than one trio setting, I just got the sense that I couldn't go deeper. I couldn't share deeper into that because I didn't feel that it would be supported. What I needed was a foundation to be held in that space, and that whatever was coming forth for me, namely issues of having grown up in segregation, that whatever would come forth would be seen and held. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't feel safe that I could go deeper into talking about that because I could feel and sense that the other person that I was sharing with was uncomfortable with my sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. And we talked a bit about this when we talked over the weekend. And it's I'm the first to admit too that when I've lived in the US now for close to 40 years, and when Obama was elected, I definitely felt this sort of incredible excitement that I thought we had turned a corner, that we were making strides towards equality in America, and was so absolutely shocked at what happened with the administration that we have just come out of. So talk a little bit about that, because, I think there is this illusion that things have improved. But clearly when we see, people being murdered by, black men being murdered by policemen, we know that there is evidence that it hasn't. But let's talk a little bit more about the naivety or, ignorance, but totally sort of innocently that we do think that things have improved more than they have. I'd love you to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right that with the election of Obama, it was a very visible indicator that we had changed substantively because, again, I remember a time when many Black people in the South didn't even have the right to vote. That to even register to vote was a very dangerous political statement. It could cost you losing your job, you're standing in the neighborhood, or worse, violence or losing your life. So to fast forward to the election of a biracial president, yes, the country had moved in some significant ways. And at the same time, with that, because this was when you immediately after the election of Obama, you saw the rise of the Tea Party, and that the Tea Party was a pushback, an immediate visceral pushback against everything that Obama stood for, namely the color of his skin, and that he and a Black woman were sleeping in the Lincoln bed in the White House. You had the Senate Majority Leader at the time, because right after Obama was elected 2 years after that, they lost the House. Republicans always maintain control of the Senate. One of the first things Mitch McConnell said, senator from Kentucky, was he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that Obama was a one-term president. He said this on the day that Obama was being inaugurated. So there were a number of people, Black, brown, indigenous people in this country that recognize that, yes, this is a wonderful thing that we've got a biracial president in the White House. But we also recognize that we've nowhere near arrived. We're not post-racial, if you will.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked also about that, as horrific as it was to see what I call the underbelly or the, people coming out of the sewers basically and spouting racism and the remarks they felt very comfortable doing during the Trump administration. But in a way, it's almost better that it's up and it's out and it's visible, so we can actually really do something about it.
I agree.
Now, as opposed to sort of live in this false security that it's not as bad as it is. So moving forward, I know, as you mentioned that as if anybody is going to do anything about this, it is, it's the spiritual community. So I'd love you to talk about what's going on in the spiritual communities right now, because we know again, innocently, there's a lot of ignorance and dismissal of your lived experience. So I'd love you to talk about that and what you would like to see differently within our spiritual communities. Yeah,
this is a pretty big subject, but it's something that definitely the conversations need to be had. I've said that I believe that spiritual communities, because of what we've experienced, what we've seen, what we've tasted, and knowing the pure essence of who we are, that tells me we're the most equipped to take on issues of discrimination and race, the ecology, all of that, because it's coming from a pure place of, hopefully, ideally, it's coming from a place of compassion. I'm convinced that was the success of Dr. King's movement, the civil rights movement in the 60s, was that it wasn't just birthed out of the Black church, it was birthed out of a spiritual conviction, a personal spiritual conviction of the man and the people that he surrounded himself with. Because this was somebody that didn't fear for his life, and his life was threatened constantly, he and his family, with threatening letters and phone calls and his home being firebombed and these sorts of things. But it took and it takes a depth of knowing and a depth of compassion that makes you move forward, confronting the forces that are coming against you, knowing that it's dangerous, and being able to stare racism in the face and be in the state of inner peace. That's the constant. That's who we are. But to be able to stare discrimination and racism in the face and not hate the racist, and not hate the racists, because that's a very hard thing to do. And that's the challenge, if you will, with a lot of otherwise activists or social movements that's not informed by this foundation of spiritual conviction.
Yeah, I love that. I love what you're pointing to, because we really, and especially within the Three Principles community, we talk about psychological innocence, and that it really is, somebody that exhibits, racism is really just caught up in some misunderstanding, some thinking that has them view the world the way they do. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's a really good point. I mean, you cannot meet hate with hate. I think, sort of having an understanding and compassion is how we come together and have deeper, more insightful conversations. I hate to use the word insightful, right. But if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You can't confront hate with hate. You can't confront violence with still more violence. Love is the most powerful force there is, but we have to know that experientially. We can't just know that intellectually or as a concept or believe that it sounds great as an idea. It has to be known experientially, because you're going to be tested to do this work. To do this kind of work. So you have to know that that the energy that's informing you, that's thrusting you or pushing you forward, because that's the energy that you're going to need when you get discouraged or when you get down. That's the thing that's going to refuel you. Yeah. And you not suffer burnout.
Yeah, I love that. That's really, yes, definitely. That is what will carry you. So talking about our spiritual communities, I know that you would like to see some changes in them. You would like to see them become more active and involved in what we are dealing with. But tell me what you would like to see within the communities themselves, how they show up.
First, I'd like to see them be more diverse. More diverse. And by that, I mean, my experience at USM, as well as my relatively new experience here in the Three Principles community, is that it's not diverse enough. There are Black and brown and indigenous people that are part of these movements. I just don't see much representation in decision-making capacities, or I don't hear enough Black and brown voices being heard or being centered. And for me, that's the missing piece, because if these communities that are mostly white remain so, there's a whole body of knowledge and information that they're not privy to. They think they have an understanding about these things, and that's what they come to the table with. So there needs to be more Black and brown voices that are centered and that are being heard and listened to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's what's so beautiful about the program that Rohini and Julie put together, is the listening. I mean, I've learned so much just by listening. I mean, having those Black and brown and indigenous voices come forward and share their experience. It's incredible. And also you mentioned about in leadership roles too. So talk a bit more about that.
Well, yeah, there just needs to be more representation from the stage, if you will. Black and brown people in a decision-making capacity. That's going to inform what needs to be done in these arenas, in these communities. Because, I don't want to knock down on white people, but the fact is that white people, for the most part, simply don't know, and they don't know what they don't know.
Absolutely, and I would agree.
Yeah, we're talking about 400 plus years of oppression and slavery and Jim Crow. 400 plus years. It's been the history of this country from its very beginnings. So we can't show up not having some context or connection to that history to think that you're going to be the solution to these problems.
Yeah, and I think we talked about it. There's a naivety and and in believing that, I know that there are words bandied about like, we're all one. There isn't, or it's just our thinking. And what are some of the others that I can think of that? Oh yes, if we all just raised our level of consciousness, that's all we think. Let's talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, Dale. Sometimes I'm not sure I even understand when I hear those words said what they really even mean. Because again, for me, it comes from the necessity of having the experience. It's what Sid talked about. It's what Sid was always pointing to. I'm reading and rereading The Missing Link and listening to Sid's lectures because I want to go back to the source, the person that actually had the experience of transcendence. And it's also what I read in the spiritual texts, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita. It's about having that transcendent experience that takes you outside of your ego identity, outside of your ego set. Now, I'm not suggesting that people haven't had that experience. I don't know. They have to answer that for themselves. All I know is coming away from an experience like that, you know the oneness of everything. You know it. It's no longer just a concept. Mm-hmm. So I don't, especially when I don't see the diversity in the voices that are called upon. I don't understand their definition of oneness when that diversity, because oneness, I know experientially. I also know that it's universal. And since it's universal, then diversity has to be a part of that. It just has to be. Mm-hmm. Because it's what's expressed in nature. Look at how diverse nature is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also find it, again, sort of dismissive when, I love the principles. Obviously, I'm a 3 principles practitioner. The show is all about the principles. Right. But I think there's a naivety when we dismiss somebody's lived experience with, well, you're experiencing it via thought. And it's not necessarily, we live in the world of illusion. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, because clearly it's more than that.
It's much more than that. And while I can agree on some very fundamental level that, yes, it is all thought, so is white privilege. That's also thought. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
It feels and it sounds dismissive because it doesn't respect lived experience. Mm-hmm. The reality is, for people that look like me, Black and brown people, indigenous people, other people of color, it's a matter of life and death for us. Because George Floyd and Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Eric Garner, mm-hmm. those men are me. Because when I get stopped by the police, I'm here in Alabama. When I get stopped by the Dothan Police Department, or when I lived in Los Angeles to get stopped by the LAPD, I have a fundamental different sense of that encounter. Because when I'm sitting in my car waiting for that officer to walk up to my vehicle, I don't know what kind of mood they're in. Mm-hmm. I don't know where they just came from, or what sort of biases or prejudices that they hold that they may not even be aware of, but that they're making a snap judgment about me simply based on the color of my skin. They don't know that I have a master's degree in spiritual psychology, mm-hmm. or that, I'm a successful musician. They just see a Black man and perceive that as a threat. Mm-hmm. And I feel pretty safe in assuming that most white people, when they're stopped by the cops, probably don't fear that they could lose their life in that encounter.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
it feels dismissive to hear another spiritual person, quote unquote, say to me, well, Alvin, that's just a function of your thinking. When I look at institutional systemic racism across the board, that's not my thinking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's not my thinking.
Absolutely. And I'm often reminded of, Sydney Banks' statement that, life is a contact sport. We're spiritual beings having a human experience, but we are in the world of form. I from my perspective, we experience the world of form via our thinking, but there is a world of form where things are taking place.
Yes.
And, you getting pulled over by an overzealous cop who might, as you say, have some prejudice and things like that. That's a real situation. That's
a very real situation.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have to, if the role of the police is to protect and serve, then why am I the one who's afraid? I shouldn't be afraid in a police encounter.
Yeah.
I'm a law-abiding citizen. I may have a busted taillight. Yeah, I may have gone a few miles over the speed limit. It happens. People do that every day.
Yeah,
but
of every color.
Of every color, right. I shouldn't have to worry, be scared shitless that this could, because I've been close to that in a police encounter where I've had guns thrown at me by the police. Yeah. So I know that experientially. So that shouldn't be.
Absolutely.
And that's not illusion. That's a very real experience. So yes, we're spiritual beings living a human experience, and we live in the world of form, which is also another level of reality. It's not illusion. It's real.
Yeah. Absolutely. We definitely see it the same way. They're totally in agreement on that. So you talk about spiritual maturity and spiritual immaturity. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that, again, it's innocent, but people can use spirituality sometimes as a, almost a cloak to hide under.
Yeah, right. I would say that it's almost like an opt-out solution.
Yeah, exactly. So talk about that.
Yeah, there's the tendency sometimes, and I think it's unique to the West here in the United States, because I see it in certain sects of the Christian faith as well, that there's a devaluing, if you will, of the physical human experience, and somehow that the spiritual is the more ideal. That should be the more valued or desired. And I don't see that in the teachings. I see that it's a marriage. It's a both and. So one of the things that defines spiritual maturity for me, Dale, is the idea of living as awakened as we can, because awakening is a process. It's not arriving. It's a continual awakening, while living fully in our bodies, fully embodied in the physical form, in the world, not of the world, not, slave to the world's systems and oppression and domination and those sorts of things. But it's the marriage of the spirit and the physical. It's both and, not either or. And knowing where our peace or our wellness comes from, that's an unfolding, it's an emergent quality that comes from the core of the true self. It's not conditioned upon ideal conditions out there in the world. Now, I know we desire, comfortable lives, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's not the source of finding our peace. And peace also isn't the absence of suffering, because there is suffering in physical world reality from time to time. We lose jobs, we lose loved ones, marriages break up, all sorts of things. And if our source of peace or wellness isn't identified from this constant, never-changing flow from the inner self, if it's conditioned upon conditions, then we're going to be all over the place emotionally, mentally, spiritually. So that's the difference for me: spiritual maturity, spiritual immaturity. One is informed by this sense of inner knowing. That's the constant, that no matter what I'm confronting, and that I'm comfortable confronting whatever life presents to me. It doesn't change me to the left or the right of who I know that I am. And that coming from that place of inner peace, then I want to share that out. I want to project that out as much as I can into the world of form. Social justice movements, the environment, sexism, a more responsible capitalism, if you will. that sort of thing.
I love that. And I totally agree with you. We are definitely on the same page here. Yeah, I think sometimes we can fall into that sort of, is it an avoidance or that spiritual sort of bypass that sometimes is a temptation. But, we are, I mean, it is a marriage. I love that word. It is a marriage of the spiritual and the human. We're not just all one as in we're all connected with each other, but we're all one as in we are both spiritual and human rolled into one. We're having this human experience. Right. And you mentioned when we talked the other day.
We're all divine emanations. I said that the other day. We're all divine emanations of this one source. But from that one source, it's expressed in a multiplicity of diversity. That's the beauty of it. That God or source, whatever you want to call that, is expressed in myriad forms. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's beautiful. And
another thing that I wanted to touch on, the tendency that I see in spiritual communities is this focus on the individual awakening, the individual becoming enlightened, if you will. And again, that's not something that I see in the text. That what I see in the spiritual text is compassion or an interest in the community, in the collective. That part of my awakening is sharing that with as many others as possible. The idea of, in Buddhism, the bodhisattva is joyfully participating in the suffering of the world because you want to snatch others out of their individual suffering, because you've seen the light, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And you want to bring others to that.
Exactly. And I mean, and that's why we do what we do as coaches. And well, certainly why I do what I do is, having suffered myself for so many years and having found this incredible way to experience life, all you want to do is share that with others and end suffering as well. So I love what you're saying. I love what you're pointing to. We can be both spiritual and activists. We can come from that beautiful, loving energy where we hold each other all up in this world, and we don't go into denial and ignore suffering and do the spiritual bypass. So, any last thoughts you'd like to share with us? Anything because I love this conversation, because it's, I'm a very practical person, so I love to hear that you're actually, you're pointing out the things that we can do now.
Well, and again, you and I are similar. I'm a very pragmatic, down-to-earth person as well. What I wanted to say related to what we've been discussing is, because I don't want people to feel guilty or whatever for their lack of social engagement, if you will. It's asking the question. It's going within the self and asking, where can I make things better? Where can I be a part of a solution? And whatever resonates for you, whatever that is. And a part of this is education, reading the books and watching the films. Like I was saying earlier, getting educated on 400 plus years of history and listening to Black and brown people. And at the end of doing that, asking yourself, what can I do? However large or small, whether it's giving money to an organization or to a cause that you believe in and want to support, or getting engaged in your local community in some way, but going out and getting actively engaged and saying, how can I be a part of the solution? How can I help? What do you need?
Yeah, I love that. And that's a wonderful note to end on, because it really is. We can all have these discussions and conversations, but unless we're actually, getting out there and doing something too, they just, fall to the wayside. So I love that.
They're just otherwise fanciful ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. And I am loving hearing more and learning more. I read a lot of books and been participating in the Reimagining Our Spiritual Communities is incredibly educational too. So thank you for what you're doing to help educate and bring awareness to a situation that needs to be addressed immediately. So
You're very welcome, Del. And thank you as well.
Oh, thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You as well.
And you. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you're interested in learning more about my coaching and mentoring packages, please reach out to me at deladeyjones@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you.